Thanks, Jim. That was great. My job is done. I don't think I can put it any better than Jim just did now, both highlighting the importance of the issue in general, for Latinos in particular, and for just the way to think about finding solutions and seeing them get to scale. Two things I should mention while my colleagues join me up here for the next session. If you know our president, Ginia Edwards, and she's sorry she can't be here, she hails from Kentucky, as does Jim. She'd have some good anecdotes or some down-home, thanks to offer as well, and so I'll thank her on her behalf. And also I'll mention that Lumina Foundation also underwrites a line of coverage in Education Week on transitions from K-12 to higher education, and so they support a lot of good work that we do, and we appreciate that support. So I'm going to kind of turn the mic over here to Deborah Villadero to play us into the next session. She's Assistant Managing Editor, Education Week. And among other things, she is also the Special Project Editor for this report. Debbie?
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to also take this opportunity to acknowledge some of the other writers on the report, some of whom are in the room today. Sitting up in the second row, we have Carolee Adams, who did the story on college transitions, and Jackie Zubricki sitting next to her, who did a lot of the profiles that you'll find in the report. And later on today, you're going to meet some of our other writers because they'll be moderating the panels here today. Now to the main event. I'd like to introduce our speakers here today. You met Chris. He's the Vice President of EPE. And as one of our senior leaders, he oversees a wide range of operations at EPE, including product development, strategic planning, fundraising, and outreach. He also heads our Research and Development Division, which is the division that puts together Diplomas Count and also Quality Counts, which you may be familiar with. The center also contributes data and analysis to a lot of our other publications at Education Week. Chris is also a frequent commentator on issues like high school dropout and completion, education policy and research standards and accountability. And his work has appeared in scholarly journals as well as having been profiled in regional and national media. Our other speaker today is Sterling Lloyd. Sterling is a senior research associate with the Research Center. He manages the development and the annual survey and data collections that feed into both Diplomas Count and Quality Counts. And before joining EPE, Sterling worked for a time at the Education Trust, where he did much the same thing and also did some reports for us. Not for us, excuse me, for the Ed Trust. And he also cut his teeth on ed policy at Howard University, where he taught an enrichment course to high school students on American education. Chris is going to talk first, then Sterling, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end of the session.
You should do the final online resources slide while you're up there. Thanks, Debbie. So without any further ado, let's get to the meat and potatoes here. As we've already kind of heard, high school reform has been a big priority on the national education scene for the better part of a decade now. And it's been able to stay in the public eye through a variety of phases. No Child Left Behind put the report on the map, put the issue on the map in many ways, really raised high schools to a place in the public eye that had really been reserved for elementary and middle schools for most of the prior decade or two. We had the small schools movement in the earlier part of the last decade, early mid part. Graduation rates itself became a major issue in policy circles, and it rightly transitioned from thinking about how many people are getting diplomas to the quality of the diplomas in high school education. And so now one of our big framings of the way we think about the quality of high school is college readiness and career readiness. And that's certainly a big part of what we focus on in Diplomas Count over the years. In the past couple of years, we've had a really strong connection between education, high school diploma, post-secondary education, and the economy coming out of the recession and looking to build a national economy moving forward. And of course, now in the past couple of years, we've also had the emergence of the Common Core standards and assessment movement, which has really, again, recast what we're asking our nation's public schools to do from just providing some basic education to providing an education that allows somebody to succeed once they get out of high school, and that's college or that's career. Over the years in Diplomas Count, and this is the 7th edition this year, we focused on a variety of the facets and nuances in different parts of the larger high school and post-secondary preparation landscape. We've done broad overviews. Kind of the first year we did a primer, kind of what are the big issues, what's the state of play. We've looked at work readiness, we've looked at transitions between high school and post-secondary, P16 councils and strategies like that. We've looked at college readiness, we've looked at data-driven reform strategies, and we also looked last year at when we're thinking about the transition to post-secondary, we're not just talking about four-year colleges, we're talking about community colleges and other types of post-secondary education that serve very large numbers of students and that are an important part of the solution of bringing post-secondary credentials back up to the first in the world. As a nation, we've set some ambitious goals in these areas, audacious goals in some cases, and there's a couple of different ways in which they've been articulated here. But when you get right down to it, it's a little bit of a numbers game. If we're going to kind of raise the graduation rate or the post-secondary completion rate by a certain level, first we need to get students into post-secondary ready to do that work, and then we need to think about the numbers. Who are the big groups of students that are not being served now, and how do we start to move the dial for them? And that was really a lot of the motivation behind this year's report, in particular focusing on Latino students. As we'll see a little bit, this is a big population, it's growing, and in a lot of ways the future of this population in the nation's schools is the future of our education system. And because the future of our education system is going to determine the future of the economy, it has extremely broad implications for our society and economy as a whole. Latinos, unfortunately, right now lag on many indicators that you would look across in education. There's been some progress, but there's a lot of challenges, and they range from educational challenges to cultural, language barriers. There's, kind of legal frameworks that the report highlights, immigration in particular, that have made things, in some cases, for students and communities harder and not easier, I think many people would argue. Inside the report, we get into a lot of these different issues, and the bullets there highlight some of the themes that come out of the reporting, and Debbie and her colleagues will help guide us through a lot of these issues as the day goes on in the sessions today. But just to mention a couple, there's a big demographic consideration here with the Latino population, given its size, given how fast it's growing, and given where Latino and Hispanic students and youths are today and where we want them to be. There's new immigration laws that have cropped up around the country, and there's a really good article in the report that really gets at the personal story behind this. The family that's profiled on the cover of the report this year and in the story has been directly impacted, as has their larger community in Foley, Alabama. Early foundations for success, preschool, good early childhood education and preparation are important for all students. Latino populations tend to lag a little bit behind, and so it makes it even more important there. We look at transitions to college. We look at barriers faced in particular for Latinas. Latino women and female students they're in a unique place, culturally, that I think is worth some discussion, and the report gets into that. And then we look at, throughout the report, a number of cases of school systems and communities that are doing really innovative work, in some cases succeeding under a lot of pressure with a lot of diverse populations, and I think there's a lot to learn from the good work that's going on out there. And just a quick plug, you'll see throughout the report profiles of students who come from the handful of largest Hispanic heritage groups, and that really literally puts a personal face on these issues, and importantly highlights the diversity of this population. So what I'll be, and myself and Sterling will be talking about this morning is mostly the research in the report, and we'll go over the highlights. There's always a lot more detail in the report and online. We won't get to everything here, but we'll get to what we think is probably the most important stuff, and we're glad to have a discussion about it afterwards. We'll go through the graduation rate analysis, which is a hallmark of Diplomas Count. There's special analysis in this report this year. Throughout the report and in the parts that deal with graduation rates, looking at Latino students in particular, provides both some broad level context, demographically, economically, educationally, as well as seeing how this population has been faring when it comes to graduation rates. And then we look at state policy, both policies related to defining what it takes to earn a diploma and an update on developments for state progress in implementing new graduation rate calculations, which we've been following for a number of years. Okay, just a quick note, and there's a note to this effect in the report as well. We're aware that there's kind of some debate in certain circles over whether kind of terminology to use to refer to this population. Should we say Latino? Should we say Hispanic? Should we refer to individual kind of heritage groups or countries of origin? There's no universal agreement. It's not a problem that needs to be solved from our perspective, and we're not going to solve it even if it was. But we just want to let you know that we are aware of that. And so you'll hear us kind of use these terms interchangeably today. You also see them used interchangeably in the report. And in the journalism in particular in the report, when we profile particular students and their families, we'll tend to refer to their particular kind of heritage group, Cuban American, Mexican American, and so forth. Just a couple of basic facts, and Jim already mentioned a few of these types of facts. Right now, and this is kind of from 2010 data, so it's actually a little bit more even today, Hispanics comprise about 51 million members of the 310 million or so US residents, and 16% of the overall population. You can see how it breaks down there. Nearly 2/3 of the population is white, 16% Latino. Latinos are the largest single racial and ethnic group in the country. And it's important to just say, and kind of most folks here in the room and online may know this, Latinos or Hispanics can be from any racial group. And so if you kind of take the Hispanic population and break down how they identify themselves in terms of race, almost 2/3 identify themselves as white. A third identify themselves as being a member of two or more racial groups. And this is if you're a big data geek like me, then you've been following this, although there has been kind of surprisingly little public discussion about this. We're kind of at the tail end of a very long transition that the federal government has been making to how we report racial and ethnic classifications. And so you're going to be seeing a lot more kind of data coming out of education systems that kind of has a lot more detail about especially multiple racial identifications. This, I think, is one of the most important things to kind of set the stage today. If we look at how old the population is, and kind of on the left-hand side here in blue, we see the overall population, and on the right-hand side, we see the Latino population. The Latino population is very young compared to the US population as a whole, and that you see it's kind of heavier up here and it's lighter down here compared to the population as a whole. That means that in the future, right, that's going to just keep on moving down. The median age for the population as a whole is 37 years. For Latinos, it's 27 years. At a national scale, dealing with these kind of numbers, 10 years is a really big difference. This is what's going to drive the projections in population that Jim mentioned and that we can see here over the next decades. Right now, Latinos make up about 16% of the population. By 2050, it's going to be about 30%. That kind of proportionally, that's almost a doubling. And that's millions, tens of millions of people. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 decades, the demographic story, the nation's become less white, it's become more Latino, and everything else is just kind of rounding error, outside of that. And so, these two facts, I think, if you're persuaded by data, these data should be persuasive, right? This is why this is such a hugely important issue for the country and education in particular. One of the kind of current status issues that we think about with the Latino population, and this affects people who are adults now, who are having children, or will have children. The Latino population has very low levels of educational attainment compared with other major demographic groups. Overall, about 2/3 of Latinos have a high school education, diploma or equivalent, or less. That's far higher than any of the other groups, so we're kind of up there. And for all the other groups, it's less than half. And so that's kind of a challenge both for Latinos who are kind of in the workforce, looking to improve their opportunities, as well as raising families, because we know that socioeconomic status, education in particular for parents, is extremely influential on children's development and prospects. getting underneath that number, the immigration story for Latinos is particularly important and worth mentioning, and it plays out in a different and much more prominent way for this population and for other groups. When you take the Latino population and you kind of separate kind of native-born and immigrants, what you see here is that it's really kind of particularly low educational attainment levels among immigrants within the Latino population that tend to drive down the overall numbers. About 3/4 of Latino immigrants do not have more than a high school education, and that's more than other groups where you tend to have more variability in terms of the population. It's an extremely diverse population. We will often kind of shorthand. We're talking about Latinos, or we're talking about Hispanics, but Latino individuals and families hail and trace their origins to all parts of the world, especially kind of Western Hemisphere, Central, South America, but elsewhere as well. If you kind of look at the Latino population in the US, and this is children younger than the age of 18, about 2/3 are Mexican, 9% are Puerto Rican, and then you see Cuban, Salvadoran, Dominican are the other largest groups. Now the remaining 15% come from a whole list of other countries, including some that aren't kind of listed out here individually. So I think it's a good reminder that not only do the kind of heritage and countries of origin of a lot of families differ, they're often in very different places socioeconomically, in terms of education and kind of family background. And the report, I think, does an excellent job of highlighting some of those differences. Now, these are important things to understand for the nation in terms of the challenges kind of we all collectively face, but bringing this into an education policy context, we need to start talking about the states. Because that's where a lot of education policy and I think a lot of drive for reform and change comes. From states, the prominence of this issue and exactly kind of what the particular challenges are and how to approach those is going to differ, right? It's going to depend on how big your Hispanic population is, kind of what the diversity mix within that population looks like. And it may also depend on things like concentrations of recent immigrants versus more established populations. If you look at school-age children, Hispanics, and kind of where they're concentrated around the country, this is kind of what we know already, right? This is kind of where we see higher concentrations, which are with the darker shading here, tend to be in kind of out in the west, places like California, Arizona, and Mexico, kind of Texas, and also kind of Florida over there. And then you get a couple, kind of states here and there that have, kind of large, especially urban enclave populations of Latinos. So this is kind of what we know. This, I think, probably does not look surprising to just about anyone. But if we kind of switch around and look at where the most recent immigration is coming, where there's higher concentrations of immigrants, kind of younger than the age of 18, it looks very different. So we'll do a little low-tech animation here. We'll kind of, overall population, immigration, and it just completely shifts, right? It's the whole different set of states. And it's interesting to note the highest kind of more recent flows of immigration have kind of come in the southeast here, Florida as well. That's kind of historically a kind of immigrant destination. And maybe not coincidentally, some of these states are the states that are taking very aggressive stances from a policy perspective. And I think what this means is that we're having kind of large influx of new populations of students who may have kind of unique types of challenges and needs from an educational perspective coming into communities and states that have not historically dealt with these issues and may have capacity or other challenges to deal with in best meeting the needs of these students. So I think it's an important part of the state context here. Okay. So kind of we've mentioned some of the challenges, but I think it's important also to just remember that there has been a lot of progress over time for this population. And although Latinos tend to be below the national average in a lot of indicators, sometimes well below, especially compared to kind of white and Asian peers, there has been progress. And I'll just give you a couple examples, and you could kind of find all sorts of other illustrations of this as well. So we like to go to NAEP, right? When you're looking for kind of real solid information over time. And so this is kind of NAEP data going back to the 1990. And what you see here is that all the groups, and kind of the three illustrated here as well, have improved considerably since 1990, looking at achievement. There's been some plateauing in more recent years, and it kind of goes up, and there's some bumps. But there's been a lot of improvement. What we see here, though, and that includes Latinos, they're kind of the lowest performing of these three groups, and this is 8th grade math as an example. But this is a situation of all boats rising at about the same rate. And so we're not seeing, everybody's improving, but we're not seeing any substantial closing of gaps here. And I think we see that with a number of educational outcomes we look at. But there are some cases where we do see more of a convergence in gap closing. And this example is, this is from the National High School Transcript Study. And this looks at students who are taking a kind of mid-level or rigorous curriculum, more than just kind of the typical or standard level of course taking. And you see here, that all groups are improving, which is what we like to see. But there's also been a closing of the gap. The gap between Latinos and whites in particular is about, closed by about half between 1990 and 2009, so about 20-year period. So there's definitely progress being made, and I think that helps to set up thinking about what this means for graduation. Things like academic performance, the kind of course taking that students have available to them obviously has implications for graduation rates. I spent a fair amount of time at the beginning of the day talking about our graduation analysis, some issues that arose this year. But I'll just kind of mention a couple of the basics here, and then we'll kind of dive into the data. Our data comes from the Common Core of Data. That's a U.S. Department of Education database reported by the states to the federal government, and the government kind of brings it all together. It's a voluntary data collection. And it's a census of public schools and districts. It's an extremely widely used and important data source within the education research community. And chances are, if it's not NAEP and you're seeing kind of data on enrollment or things like that, it's from the Common Core. We use a single calculation method, the Cumulative Promotion Index, or CPI, to calculate a graduation rate. So we've got a common data source across the country, common calculation, and that's one of the unique things we bring to this line of work. So it lets us do really comprehensive analysis. We can go from the district level all the way up to the national level within a consistent analytic framework. There are strengths and limitations to these approaches. We kind of heard a limitation that arose this year, but I think the consistency of the data across the nation and the comparability is very important and still serves an important purpose. Okay, so here's the good news, right? So graduation rates for the class of 2009 public schools, this is the most recent year we have data for, have risen to 73.4%. That's 1.7 points higher than last year, so that's a substantial increase over time. And the especially good news is this is the second year we've seen a consistent increase in the rate. There were a couple years before that where the rates were kind of stuck or declining slightly, and there were some concerns that we were kind of going in the wrong direction. This looks like we're continuing on the kind of positive trend we hoped we were getting a glimpse of last year. This has been widespread, especially if you kind of back up and look over the past decade. The nation as a whole has improved, most of the states have improved, and all major demographic groups have improved. I'm pointing at this, but of course the things back there. If we kind of take a really historical view here, and this is kind of something I kind of like to remind us, we're not going to talk in detail about 1870, although it's way back there at the beginning. It's kind of at the dawn of public education in the country, really. So we're at 73.4% right now. The high point historically was in the late 60s at 77%. So we're not quite up there, but we're at the highest point we've been since the late 1970s. And so we can kind of see from kind of at this point, we've got a nice trajectory here that we're hopefully kind of getting back to exceeding those historic levels. One of the interesting twists on the patterns for this year, sometimes you see when the rate increases for the nation, all the groups are increasing more or less. It's a little bit different this year. So we've got some small decreases for kind of Asians, and whites are pretty flat, and a small decrease for Native Americans. Latinos had a really large increase in the past year in graduation rates, and I think that's probably in large part due to the reform work that's been going on for the better part of a decade, and hopefully targeting the groups, Latinos and African Americans, who are probably in many ways in most need of this additional focus. And so large increase for Latinos, driving a lot of the national increase, as well as a modest increase for African American students. So that's good news. There's still more than 1 million students failing to earn a diploma every year. And kind of this is how it breaks out. That's about 6,000 students lost every school day. A student lost every 29 seconds. That's still too many. The majority of the students who are not earning diplomas are members of historically disadvantaged minority groups as well. And so it is a particular problem that we're still dealing with as a nation. And so, it's good to pat ourselves on the back that we're moving in the right direction, but we can't, just kind of sit back and let things coast. We get these kind of gaps across racial and ethnic groups, which we talk about a lot, kind of as a field. There's also very large differences from state to state, and in a lot of cases even more dramatic than across demographic groups. So we've got the national average, 73.4. You've got, on the one hand, a group of 6 states that are kind of 80% or above, and you can kind of see who they are listed out there. New Jersey had the highest rate this year. At the other extreme, you've got, a small number of states that are graduating less than 60% of their students, and you can see who those are there. Most of the states, though, are, kind of in the middle, right? They're within a few, 3-4 percentage points, give or take, of the national average. And so there's obviously room for improvement. We have seen this kind of creep up over time as the graduation rates improved. So again, moving in the right direction. Okay, so we kind of looked at the experiences of Latino students in particular, and we can kind of see here how we kind of place those within the context of kind of minority male graduation rates. And so although the graduation rates are kind of lower for all students who are Latino or African American or Native American, minority males, and there's been a lot of good attention to this over the years and a lot of good work, have suffered especially with the dropout crisis. And right now we're seeing minority male graduation rates anywhere between the hair below 50% to getting close to 60%. For Latino males. And that's substantially below the kind of group averages, and what we see when we look, kind of nationwide at the gender gap, we get about a 7 percentage point gap between males and females. Females graduate at higher rates. For the nation as a whole, it varies some across racial and ethnic groups, and it's substantial for Latinos as well. Because graduation rates for Latinos are lower than the national average, that means Latinos are disproportionately represented among the nation's dropouts. And so you can kind of see the breakout here. Latinos make up about 21% of the public school population, right? So that's more than the 16% of the general population, which includes older people as well. So that kind of speaks to the young population. But they make up 27% of dropouts. And you can see kind of what the kind of share is among the other racial and ethnic groups. We've given some attention over the years to the extent to which the dropout crisis in the country is concentrated in certain places, right? And that kind of tells you kind of where the challenges are the greatest, but on the flip side, it also tells you where, if you can get the right kind of leverage, you can really move the needle, right? If you've got a big district with, a significant challenge and you can turn that district around, if it's a big enough district or a handful of districts, that can make the national rate rise, actually. And so if we kind of pull out from the Latino dropout figure before, so that 27%, it's about 310,000 dropouts who are Latinos in kind of recent years. When you look where those students are located, about half of those Latino dropouts are located in or kind of produced by California and Texas. Big states, big Latino populations, that's not a surprise. But we also kind of looked at the district level to see how this was concentrated, and we've kind of done this in the past in different ways. And for Latinos, only 25 districts, just a little bit more than 24 in the entire country, it's 11,000 districts that serve high schools. So 25 districts account for 37% of all Latino graduates. That's extremely concentrated. It's more concentrated than we see for the population as a whole. And you can see some of the reasons why that's the case. People have images kind of about Hispanic and Latino students and the environments they live in. It's hard to know kind of how accurate they are. It's always good to have data. So these may or may not kind of surprise some people. So this tells you the district context of the typical Latino student versus a typical white student. Latino students are served typically by much, much larger school districts, right? The median district size for the typical Latino student in the country, 25,000 students. That's a big district. Kind of around this, around the national capital, we've got these big, giant county-wide districts, and that doesn't seem like very much. The average, the typical district in the country is only 3,000 or 4,000 students. It's a little bit larger for whites. So much, much larger, much more likely to be urban. Latinos enrolled in districts with higher concentrations of ELL students, that's probably not a big surprise. More likely to be attending, kind of living in poverty, more likely to be socioeconomically as well as racially segregated, and you can kind of see. So it's a much different profile, and I think that speaks to the challenges that a lot of the school systems that serve Latinos are facing. And that is part of what's behind these numbers we're seeing. In particular, kind of the urban and district size, some of the concentration of the problem. Again, the slightly positive way to look at this is that if we can get leverage and really kind of turn things around in a manageable number of districts, that makes a difference on a national scale.
Chris, we might have time for just one more slide.
Yep. So finally, what we've got here, and kind of mention that we've got some special analysis in the report this year that looks at districts around the country that are beating the odds when it comes to Latino graduation. And there's some more detail in the report, but we identified 30 large districts serving majority Latino populations. And kind of here's the ones that come up on top of the list. And so we encourage you to take a look. We think these are places that are kind of worth taking a closer look at. And they're kind of a proof point. They show that even if school systems are facing challenges, some of those are generating really good results. And we've got California and Arizona, but we've also got some districts in other parts of the country as well. And Sterling is going to walk us through real quickly some of the policy findings from this year's report.
Thanks, Chris. This portion of the presentation provides an overview of state policy based on data collected primarily through the Research Center's annual high school accountability survey. As in the past, the Research Center examines state policies in 3 central areas related to high school graduation: definitions of college and work readiness, high school completion credentials, and exit exams. But this year, we also tracked state implementation of uniform graduation rate calculations now required by federal Title I regulations. Prompted in part by efforts to implement the Common Core standards, our survey results indicate that states are focusing on college and work readiness. Those results show continuing increases in the number of states defining readiness for college and work. 37 states have now defined college readiness, 4 more than last year, and 26 more than in 2007, the first year we tracked that indicator. Since last year, the Research Center finds little change in most graduation requirements and indicators across the states. However, in what may signal a new trend, some states have reduced the variety of credentials offered to students completing high school. 23 states, 3 fewer than last year, report offering an advanced diploma or other forms of recognition for students exceeding standard graduation requirements. Similarly, the number of states awarding alternative credentials, such as certificates of completion, for students not meeting requirements for a regular diploma, declined from 29 to 26. Total credit requirements for earning a standard diploma held steady at 21 credits, and roughly half the states require students to pass an exit exam, the same as the year ago. In addition to traditional policy challenges, states are also grappling with a new way to measure high school graduation rates. The No Child Left Behind Act broke new ground in 2002 by mandating that accountability ratings under the law take high school graduation rates, along with test scores, into account. Unlike rules regarding test scores, initial federal guidelines related to graduation allowed states substantial latitude when implementing key NCLB provisions. In the subsequent years, states were permitted to employ a variety of methods for calculating graduation rates and to set very different targets for the percentage of students expected to earn a diploma. In 2008, prompted by concerns over the accuracy and uniformity of state-reported statistics, the U.S. Department of Education issued regulations requiring all states to transition to a uniform, cohort-based method for calculating graduation rates and to use the resulting rates for federal accountability purposes. As of this year, for the first time, all states are required to calculate and report graduation rates using the same method, the 4-year adjusted cohort rate. To mark this milestone, the Research Center conducted an original 50-state survey intended to gauge states' progress in putting the 2008 regulations into effect. Our survey results indicate that as of April, 43 states and the District of Columbia had publicly reported graduation rates using the adjusted cohort method. 4 additional states were poised to report their rates but had not done so as of our survey deadline. 3 states, Idaho, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, indicated they do not plan to report rates using the new federal formula this year. Most states expect to meet the requirement to use adjusted cohort rates for federal AYP accountability determinations for the 2011-12 school year. In fact, 23 states have already done so for 2010-11 AYP. All of the remaining states, with the exceptions of Idaho, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, plan to use their cohort-based rates for 2011-12 accountability decisions. And as I wrap up, let me tell you all about the online resources that we offer as part of the report. We offer state graduation briefs breaking down information in the report on a state-by-state basis. We also provide all of the indicators in our searchable database, Education Counts. We have many years of indicators in that database. And we also offer EdWeek Maps, which allows users to zoom in on their state and locate the graduation rate for any school district in the nation with a high school. With that, I'll turn things back over to Chris and Debbie.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Yes, you.
Hi, I'm with Hispanic Link News Service, and thank you so much for providing this report. Some of these numbers have been hiding in plain sight for years. Just one quick question. When the Obama administration released its education blueprint a few years back, and they started to give out some of the grants, the competitive grants, none of the states west of the Mississippi got anything, and that's where the Hispanic population is mostly based. So it seems that while there has been some gains, there's still not enough. So what, other than highlighting numbers in the report, what are you guys ready to recommend at a national level to make sure that those numbers increase?
Okay.
Yeah, so as a kind of news organization, we, and an independent one, we don't take positions on particular policies, but we try to make sure people have full understanding of the issues. You know, that's an important perspective, right? So a lot of the de facto kind of national policy in education in recent years has been driven by these, you know, handful of competitive programs that have had very high profile and also have kind of broader effects to kind of drive change even for folks who don't kind of win those. It is important to kind of take a look not just at kind of who the states are, but who the states serve. And I think I have not heard a lot of discussion about that particular issue. The fact that this geographical divide we tend to see in some of these kind of award programs does have implications because of the way different student populations are, you know, kind of distributed across the country. So I think that's an important issue, and kind of hopefully in the reporting we do in Diplomas Count and Education Week in general, it gives people kind of a better appreciation for those types of issues. We don't take, you know, policy positions ourselves.
Do you recommend anything to make sure that the numbers improve?
Yeah, I think where we can provide kind of help in those regards is when you look at the reports and our ongoing reporting about the districts that are profiled and the types of approaches that seem to be meeting with success. And there's a couple good examples, and kind of Debbie, you know, would probably kind of have, you know, and kind of colleagues from the newsroom would be able to kind of offer some more specifics on there. But we try to do that by kind of raising broader understanding of the issues and some of the complexities behind that, as well as giving people some good examples of how this is really working out on the ground. Not just the challenges, but where we're seeing improvements.
There's another question in the back row here.
Can you cite specific factors that have led to this increase in graduation rates? I don't think I got that from what you discussed.
I think what we're seeing, and we don't kind of do a formal policy analysis, say this policy did this or that, is, kind of our interpretation is that what we're seeing is the kind of the fruits of a better part of a decade of reform. This has been very widespread, and the fact that we're seeing improvements for a lot of areas around the country, as well as a lot of student groups, I think points to the more general kind of state and I think especially local reform strategies. Over the years in the report, we've highlighted a couple things that some of them are sexy and some of them are not real sexy. One of the things that I think has been especially important, for example, for high school reform and graduation rate in particular, is data. I'm a data guy, so what else am I going to say? But there's been a lot of talk about early warning systems. Some of the states or some of the districts that have seen big improvements, and some of them are big districts like, say, New York, or part of the way they really turn things around when it comes to graduation is understanding kind of what their challenges are, and they can learn that through data. They can learn kind of who is at risk, how many students are at risk to not graduate, and kind of what do we know about them. It's not again, that's not a population that's all the same. You have some students who are kind of over age and have hardly any credits, some students who are kind of on age and just a few credits shy, and kind of everything in between. And kind of some good work was also done in Philadelphia to kind of really break it down. Kind of who are our at-risk populations and what types of tailored and targeted programs do we need to serve them. And another good example is early warning systems, that as states have developed more robust data systems and kind of data has become more kind of part of the reform culture, have been really important in identifying students who are at risk for kind of going off the path to graduation as early as late elementary school. And so I think that's one example of kind of what we've seen as a broad trend in kind of reform as well as kind of data systems that's kind of converged around this issue. And it's something that can have broad-based implications for improving graduation rates.
And there's another question right behind the first questioner.
Hi, this is Sean Kennedy, Lexington Institute. I had a quick question because it wasn't broken out in your research, but do you have anything to speak to either charter or Catholic school or either other alternative school success relative to the Latino population's graduation rates? I know dealing with NAEP data, it's obviously very limited in the case of those, but graduation rates are something we can actually track. So are these overperforming public schools, or is there any kind of trend line you see there in terms of how Hispanic students are doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately this database is kind of not in any better position than NAEP is to deal with that. So we use a Common Core of Data that's a public school database, and so we don't have information on Catholics or other private schools. And although charter schools are public schools, it just happens to be the fact that there's very little good information in the database on charter schools, and so we have virtually no graduation information for charters, and so most of what you see here is regular public schools. I think the Catholic school dimension of this is an interesting one, and kind of it so happens I'm the product of mostly Catholic education kind of coming up, and there's something about kind of the culture and the size and the way in which, and there's been a lot of research on this as well, the way that Catholic students approach kind of the student population in general, and also more disadvantaged students. That I think there was a lot of attention to this in the kind of 80s and 90s. Yeah, and this has kind of come up actually recently as kind of Catholic schools being similar to other types of kind of charter and other reform models in terms of the school culture and other parts of how the schools work. What's the mechanics and what's it like to be a student there? That, I wonder whether we're going to kind of see folks kind of come around and look at kind of what that experience is like. And of course, since the 80s, Catholic schools have kind of seen a lot of changes in terms of enrollment and other things. But there's something about kind of school culture that, could sound real mushy, but if we kind of are really disciplined about it and get inside what schools look like and kind of what it is that schools and school leaders and kind of the student population is doing, I think that can be very instructive.
We have a question in the first row.
Yes, I'm Beatriz Arias from the Center for Applied Linguistics. I wondered if in your analysis of state policy, you looked at state language policies, the extent to which English-only policies start to act as a barrier towards high school graduation.
We didn't look at that. A few years ago for quality counts, we did a special focused report on English language learners, and we collected data on policies related to that population. But for this particular report, we did not focus on that.
A question in the back here.
Thanks. Robert Mahaffey with the Rural School and Community Trust. This is great research and analysis, and it's going to be very valuable. One thing that I think is overlooked, and a report that we do, is Why Rural Matters, using a lot of the same data, Chris, that you use, is that per capita, the percentage of Latina students in K-12 is growing higher in rural communities than any place else in the country. So while you're looking at population counts, the impact on rural communities is much more significant because it's a larger percentage of the population and growing. And your slides point that out as far as immigrant populations, because those southern states are all very, very rural. So as far as policy implications, are you going to dig deeper into this as far as demographics are concerned? Because the issues we face in rural schools are significantly different than what's happening in urban core, and the diversity of those populations is increasing, as is the level of poverty. So if you could address that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that is something that, although we didn't talk about it much, it does really very much come out of the data when you look at the immigration patterns and kind of where we're seeing the growth. We don't have any particular plans for a big project on this. We do cover rural issues as part of our ongoing reporting, but I think it's something for us to stir into the pot as we think about, kind of larger issues, because rural populations, although any given rural district is not going to, kind of be of the same scale as a New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, there's a lot of them out there. And so that does really add up, and the challenges are distinct. And when we're looking at particular demographic populations or kind of the influence of immigration and the capacities of small communities and small school systems to deal with change and challenges, I think it's an important issue, and it's worth some more thought.
I would also direct you to one of the stories in that issue, the story on immigration policy in Foley.
I love the cover.
Yes. In the middle.
Hi, my name is Dora Elias McAllister. I'm from the University of Maryland. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about immigration policy and how that impacts students, specifically in higher education. You say that's an issue, but there's other reports like Excelencia in Education recently did a report that said that 88% of students in higher education are U.S. citizens, and another 11% are residents. So really, how much of an impact is immigration policy really having for access and success for students in higher education?
Well, I'll let Debbie say a word about this in a second, because she's kind of well into the reporting on this. I think you're right, and I think one of the things that we didn't spend a lot of time in this report, although in kind of quality counts a couple of years ago did. I think there's some real misperceptions about kind of the scale of the kind of immigrant population, right? When you look at English language learners, a lot of people think immigrants, right? Kind of in their heads. And I think Latinos population, people often think that. Most Latinos, most English language learners are native-born Americans, large majority in the public schools. And so in terms of kind of sheer numbers, it's maybe not as many students who are as directly impacted personally because they are immigrants with these policies, but there's a real chilling effect that affects larger communities and families that's kind of more, that kind of goes well beyond just that, percentage of the population that's kind of not native born.
Yeah, and I would point you to the same source, in this community that Leslie Maxwell visited. There was a ripple effect in terms of Alabama's immigration law. And it's also important to note that although Alabama's law probably cracked down the hardest on immigrant groups, there are at least 6 or 7 other states that were passing similar laws recently.
One more.
In the front row?
Paul?
I'm Betty Smallwood, also from the Center for Applied Linguistics. You talked about the upper level, but I wondered if your data showed anything about the effects of preschool. We know that by kindergarten it becomes very uneven, especially with the Common Core, it's going to become more so. And the numbers, looking from a data point of view, of Latino population enrolled in preschool.
Do you mind if I? We actually have a story on this as well, because there does seem to be a real disparity there in terms of the percentage of Latinos who are enrolled in preschool. We look at one community that's been successful in enrolling their Latino students. But I don't know specifically what the data says with regard to the future prospects of Latino kids who go to preschool. But nationally, there certainly is a link between preschool and success later on in school.
Great.
We have online questions as well, and
Yes, we
Paul
do.
has one of those.
Okay, our question comes from Bill in our live stream chat, and he asks, what's the current conversation around online education, broadband access, and rural or migrant populations?
There's a lot wrapped up in that question. If somebody doesn't have to kind of face you right here in the room, they can ask big questions like that. Those are all important issues, and I think it actually speaks to, kind of connects with the earlier point about rural populations and kind of how that overlaps with certain, demographic groups or students with other types of experiences. I think when we're looking at kind of high school reform and historically disadvantaged populations, whether it's Latinos or whether it's students who are living in kind of highly concentrated highly impoverished, concentrated communities within urban areas, I think we're looking for all sorts of strategies. Kind of broadband access, virtual education are important in a lot of different ways, for a lot of different populations in different ways. You see kind of online learning used for credit recovery in urban areas to kind of offer higher level high school courses in places where there may not be qualified teachers, and there's a different way that plays out in a more rural community where kind of distance learning can be very important. Is actually in rural communities a lot of the places where the most innovative approaches are being taken. So I think those are some big points, but I think very important ones that kind of do tie into the theme of this year's report. So me standing up like this is my subtle way of saying our time is up for this session. That's our last question. I kind of like to thank Debbie and Sterling, my colleagues here. And we're going to move right into the next session here. So I will